This conference will now be recorded.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight on our non-normal committee night. I will open up the Building, Zoning, and Development Committee meeting this evening at 7 p.m. Present are committee members Williamson, Limpert, and Schuman, council members Glassburn and Heeman, our law director, planning director, our building official, and guests. On the agenda this evening is a continuance of our discussion on Ordinance 2020-78, which is an ordinance providing for the amendment of Chapter 1115, definitions of the codified ordinances of the City of North Olmsted, and Ordinance 2020-79, which is an ordinance providing for the replacement of Chapter 1163 signs of the codified ordinances of the City of North Olmsted as amended. I believe that everyone should have received from our council clerk the amendments for the discussion this evening. Yay. Has everyone had an opportunity to look them over? Because I believe we're just going to maybe start the conversation here and move forward. I think that perhaps even at some point, the committee taking a vote on whether to proceed with these amendments or not. So at this point, I will leave it up to either Director Lieber or Director Garreau to start us off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've done my best to compile those amendments and the feedback that was presented by members of council either at the committee meeting or individually by email. And so there's 11 items that I believe were proposed that could result in changes. I guess I'd invite Director Garreau if there's any guidance he wants to give before I start going through the substance to be able to chime in before I take up some of your time. Give him the floor.
Madam Chair, if I may. Thank you. I kind of agree with your approach. Maybe we should kind of pick these off, see if there's any particular feeling on the committee on whether to move forward with some of these proposed amendments. I know Director Lieber has gone through and spent quite a bit of time going through and addressing some of those. I do want to point out there's a couple things that were directed toward me, and I kind of construed it as a request for some legal advice to Mr. Glassburn that was not shared with everybody. Mr. Glassburn, if he wants to, share that with you or tell me to share with you, that's fine. But in terms of the ordinance, you'll notice there's an ordinance that's before you. The amendment was written today to give you an idea of how we could roll in a COVID policy into the ordinance under section, I think 6, I think it is, where Director Lieber drafted that. I redrafted the ordinance and incorporated it to give hopefully some relief to the business community during the public health emergency. So on my end, I kind of touched on the two things with Mr. Glassburn. I did consult with Director Lieber, and she was working to make those changes, which not changes, but comments and responses that you have before you. So as far as I'm concerned, that's going to be it for me now, and then I'll jump in as needed, okay?
Okay. Are there any, Director Lieber, did you want to?
Sure, and I'm happy to go through these one by one, and then I'll finish just a brief description of the one, and if council wants to discuss or take action, maybe we could do it that way rather than talk about everything and come back to everything. I'll try and be efficient with our time. Okay, so the first proposed amendment was by Committee Chair Williamson, who wanted relief for businesses by allowing additional temporary signage during the pandemic. That is the amendment that Mr. Garreau referred to in the ordinance itself, and there's an accompanying policy It's somewhat similar in nature to the current policy we've been using that allows for some additional temporary signage until the end of any governmental regulations that would limit business operations. It would allow for 2 additional temporary signs. And this is in addition to the temporary signs that are currently permitted. So it's not a total of 2, it would be everything that the ordinance would otherwise permit, and then 2 in addition, and that is per business unit. So a big challenge is not every property is created equal. Some are plazas with multi-tenant, some are big boxes on one lot. It's nearly impossible to come up with a policy that would be fine-tuned for every scenario. So I err on the side of being overgenerous because I believe, from what I heard from council, that was the will of council, was to provide more opportunity and to be less restrictive. So that is how it was written into this policy, to allow 2 additional signs per business unit. So in some cases that could be a lot of additional signage in some of our commercial areas. But it seemed to me the most fair way to do it, rather than allow just a lot to have a couple additional signs that might have multiple tenants, where, you know, there might be another single use building on a different lot. So I guess that would be the first one for council discussion.
Thank you, Director. Does Mr. Schuman?
Thank you. I actually have no problem with this at all. I think it's a good idea. I think any relief we can give to people right now. And I'm sure that as springtime rolls around, if we're still in dire straits here, some of those tents that have gone up or might go up in the spring for some of the restaurants and stuff, they'll want to have signage on them. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do at this point. So yes, thank you.
The only addition that I would like to make is perhaps addressing vehicles with signs on them. Can we make that part of this COVID policy as well? With the conditions that the vehicles are operable, licensed, and I don't know if there's any other suggestions from committee or council? None. Okay, is it possible to put something in there then? I'm on, can you hear me, Michael?
No,
I can hear you. Mr. Limpert has his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see that. You need to jump up and down, please. Okay. Go ahead.
yeah. So with the vehicle, you're saying that to allow vehicle signs, and as long as obviously the vehicle is operable with no time constraints.
At least during the COVID policy.
Sorry, I meant for like consecutive hours of being there. Like it can just be parked permanently there as long as it's operable and licensed, is what you're proposing?
During the COVID, yes.
How does that differ from our current? Do we have anything on vehicles right now? So we're waiving that? Vehicle
signs are currently prohibited. So this would be a temporary waiver, it sounds like, during the COVID policy, while the COVID regulations are in place.
I have reservations about it being just permanent with no time restrictions. I know you're talking from a length of days from related to COVID, but just having people park vehicle signs as long as the vehicle's licensed registered permanently, I see that as maybe a little excessive for the COVID relief. Because we are allowing other ways to do signs during this relief. I'm totally on board with the proposal you had, but just adding where a vehicle can be parked out there as signage permanently, I'm just not sure about that, I guess. from my
Well,
perspective.
we can put additional restrictions on it where it has to be moved. Perhaps, every week, every 2 weeks, moved along the property line, repositioned, however, we can word it however we want. But I would like to see this added into our COVID policy. I saw some other hands up. Ms. Heeman and then Mr. Glassburn.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question is, so we're really restricting that, we are not permitting like signs on trucks, okay? If we delay the implementation until after an appropriate COVID relief policy or change of direction by the state, for example, lifting restrictions, then I don't know what difference it would make that we would need to include that. If we're going to hold off implementation anyway, I don't think it matters. Or did I not understand that we might be holding off implementation? Did I get that wrong?
Well, so I thought later, well, Mr. Glassburn could go first.
Someone could answer my question. That would be good.
I'm deferring to Director Lieber on that one, or our building official, or our law director, whoever wants to take the wheel here.
If the question is, are we delaying the adoption of our new sign code altogether? I know that is an amendment proposed by Councilman Glassburn, but I don't think it's one that the committee has yet discussed or necessarily agreed to yet. So I think we'll get to that question later tonight.
Okay. But in that event, so should that be chosen, right, then none of this discussion matters because we would be delaying implementation anyway. So we wouldn't need to have a truck specific COVID policy. So that's all I wanted to kind of figure out for myself, I suppose.
And on that issue, Madam Chair, just before we move on, we currently prohibit vehicle signs. So there's no current ability to have vehicle signs under our code. So I think what Councilwoman Williamson's saying would be a change to that current code.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your leeway on this. It's frustrating. I have an interpretation. It sounds like Mary Ellen has an interpretation and Councilman Lippert has a different interpretation. When you receive this information 6 hours before the meeting, after we gave ours 3 weeks in advance, it's not really helpful to be able to determine. Now, Director Guerrero, I see you're shaking your head. I appreciate that you reached out last night, but this is why we have confusion sometimes, because not all of us can read this during the business day. Now, with that said, there are provisions in this new proposal that make things easier and more liberalized. There are things that constrict. The suggestion that I made overall was not to just categorically eliminate and delay everything indefinitely. It was to, if we cannot separate those that make things easier, that we not make this worse. I think that's what Chairwoman Williamson is getting at with the truck question and with these other measures. I support all of what she is suggesting, because I think any kind of picking fights with folks trying to get the word out, especially when they have different configurations of their properties right now, is just asking for a fight that is not helpful to the city and is not helpful to the residents or the businesses while we're dealing with this pandemic. So thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you. Mr. Lippert.
Yeah, my confusion was simply that my understanding, which was proven correct, is that vehicle signs aren't permitted currently, and the proposal is that they're not going to be permitted in the new code. So the idea of allowing them just during the COVID to me was confusing more to residents, because now you're saying, oh no, well, you can do it for this short period of time, even though you never could. And by the way, once this is over, you're not going to be able to do it again. And I realize that maybe that that holds true slightly for some of these right-of-way signs, etc. But just to me, it seemed like an over easement, I guess, of the current policy and the future policy to just enable vehicle signs. I thought that would create maybe more confusion than it does by adding it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Glassburn, and then Mr. Schuman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilman Limpert is correct as to what the state of the law would be in each of these phases, but there's a reality of, and this is not just a by the way reality, there's a reality of what is enforced and what is not enforced. We have had vehicle signs for some time now in this city, prominently displayed on major establishments in very public places. So the question is, by making this new change, is that correlating to a new level of enforcement, whether it's the vehicle signs or right-of-way signs or any of these things? If we do selective enforcement, if we are not consistent, we will lose when we get challenged. And so we have to be careful to only put forward things that we intend to actually enforce consistently. Now, that may be consistently lax, that may be consistently strict, but we have to be consistent. We can't just go after one set of problems and ignore the rest. Thank you.
Mr. Schuman had his up before you, Mr. Garreau, if he wants to let.
Why don't you let Mr. Garreau respond? I think that.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
I have to tell you, I've been doing this for 10 years now, and I'm not exactly sure what's happening with this ordinance. And first of all, I apologize, Mr. Glassburn, if you didn't get the level of attention that you demand, but you got your answers. And if you'd wanted them sooner, I apologize, but you got the answers that you were looking for. I hope they're satisfactory. And I speak for Director Lieber as well. So I'm not sure exactly what we're trying to do here. The code that we have right now needs to be amended. There are deficiencies with it. Latching on to this idea that they're not being enforced is not an accurate representation of what's happening, Mr. Glassburn. There are some provisions of temporary signage that we have been holding back on because we have a code we've been working on for a year. That code is now held in committee. Okay, so we're trying to address a number of the concerns that we have as a community, as representation in our community, to ensure that we have a code that is valid, that is fair, that is enforceable. There are a number of provisions that I think are constitutionally suspect. Okay, enforcement is not one of the things I'm concerned about right now. I've said in the past, and you've latched onto this idea that we're not enforcing the code. We are enforcing the code. Okay, in terms of certain temporary sign issues, correct, because I think they're constitutionally suspect. If your concern is selective enforcement, which I think is a very rare concern, my concern is enforcing a code that's constitutionally invalid. So up until now, it's been my advice this entire time to in areas where we have a code that is constitutionally suspect. We've known this. We're working on it. We've been working on it, Director Lieber, for a year and a half, I think, to try to solve these problems. We present you with solutions to the problems, and then you question whether the solutions to the problems are valid. And what I'm telling you is this code was crafted with an expert in sign code drafting. We hired her. Director Lieber has 2 decades of experience. Myself, not so much, but I certainly know a thing or two about constitutional law. What we've presented you folks with is what we believe to be a good policy. We will enforce that policy. It will be presented to the full vote of council from the committee. If it's passed as it's written, it's going to be enforced, and it's going to be constitutional, and it's going to be hopefully fair to the business community. It allows more opportunities for the business community if it's passed than it has right now. There is no set of circumstances where I, as your law director, would recommend that you choose to just punt this down the road until June or September. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's bad policy. It puts us in a situation where this community is not able to enforce the code because the code is suspect. I'm not going to enforce a code that I believe is constitutionally infirm. I'm not doing it. I think it puts the city at jeopardy, and I'm not going to do it. Mr. Burns knows, he's been through this. The city's been sued. We lost $150,000 or whatever it was 20 years ago. I'm not doing it. So I think that the proper way to do it is to recognize the situation that we have and to craft the code that we think is constitutionally firm, that we think is going to pass muster, which this one certainly does, and to pass it as soon as we can. We've crafted ideas for how to solve some of the problems that you folks have presented. We've given them to you. I mean, if you have other ideas, then let's hear them. But the idea of punting this thing down the road until sometime in June, I highly counsel against that as your legal advisor. I think it puts the city in jeopardy, and I don't think you should do it. Ultimately, it's your choice.
Mr. Schuman, did you,
I can't remember. Thanks.
thank you, Mr. Glassburn.
I want to get to the substance of this so we can make decisions and move on. This is more or less a work session from my view. But no, presenting information that you want seriously discussed by multiple people who are professionals less than 24 hours in advance is not helpful. It just isn't. It's not about hurting my feelings. It's not about whether I like what you're doing or not. It's not helpful. It doesn't provide time to look at what has been offered.
The ones you presented 3 weeks ago is the same code you've had since July. So don't tell me that you didn't get the answers in a timely fashion, Mr. Glassburn. You have had since July to deal with this issue. So don't tell me that you're not satisfied with the speed at which the concerns are being addressed. Now let's move on and have a decent discussion instead of complaining about what you believe to be insufficient timeliness of a response.
Mr. Groh, it's the chairwoman's meeting, not yours.
Madam Chair, thank you for indulging me.
Mr. Limpert.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess the question is as it relates to these amendments. So we're trying to work through these one by one. So us as a committee, Councilman Schuman, myself, and you, we pretty much agreed on the first proposed change, with the exception of you want to add a vehicle exception during, what could be a proposed COVID time. And I guess that would be the only part that I would hesitate, because I think it's confusing to permit that and then take it from what the code currently doesn't allow and then reinstitute that it's not allowed again. But the rest of the leeway I'm in favor of. So I don't know how we want to do these. Do we want to do these as like amendment by amendment and vote on that, or should we cover all of this and we can circle back to whether we want to add the vehicle or not at the end? But other than that, I thought the first point we kind of agreed that that's a good thing to put in.
All right, well then we can come back to that, number one, prior to the close of this meeting. Okay. Shall we continue then? Mr. Burns, I'll give you a moment, but I'm going to leave guest speakers or comments for the end of our work session.
I understand, and I understand your question about vehicle signs and the COVID provision that's been added to the ordinance. And my thought is that the new sign code and the COVID provision are both in the same ordinance, will be passed and effective at the same time. And personally, I think, and maybe Kim will agree with it, that the ordinance, the revised ordinance that we're passing or talking about, adequately addresses vehicle signs. And so we don't really have to address it in the COVID provision that is currently being added to the ordinance.
Madam Chair, I just think that goes back to the perspective of if you want to allow for these signs or not allow for these signs. If the committee is not ready to take a vote on number one, we can always move on to number two.
Which we are. We're moving on. Thank you.
Okay. So, and all of these all of these items have been discussed at a meeting or by email at one point or another in advance of this particular meeting, except for the amendment proposed by Mr. Schuman. But all of these others are not new discussion items of this committee. The second requested amendment was by Mr. Limpert to allow electronic message centers to be installed on designated city landmarks. So the recommendation that he made was to eliminate the words out of 11, that's a typo, 116312 C8A, or containing a North Olmsted landmark. So the sentence would end, the sentence would read, only one ground sign on each lot may have an electronic message center, except that electronic message centers shall be prohibited on lots within any locally designated historic district, period.
Yeah, I am, that's exactly what I was proposing.
Mr. Schuman?
I'm comfortable with this change. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we just take a vote then on this change and keep going? Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So does this then, what happens to the idea, Mr. Limpert, that the church was able to have a ground sign? Is that the ground sign that they have now? Or if they want a new ground sign, they can have a new ground sign? I thought the change, you were talking about was that it would not have to be, that it would not be permitted to be attached to a landmark building. And in this language, it sounds like it's just not okay at all to be in the historic district on the lot. That it's
No,
one ground sign.
Madam Chair,
Thank you.
they removed the landmarks. They reland the landmarks, not historic district, the landmarks. So landmark buildings are not prevented from having a sign. Not in the historic district. It's landmarks. Publicly city designated landmarks.
Okay. Is it the committee's pleasure then to proceed with our own vote on this? Mr. Schuman agrees? Yes? Okay, so then number 2, shall we move forward then with including that as a provision in this amendment?
Second.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, okay, that's with 3-0. Thank you, Director.
Madam Chair, the third one is an amendment proposed by Mr. Schuman that would prohibit electronic message centers to be installed in residential districts. And so this would add language into that sentence that we just read. It would now read, only one ground sign on each lot may have an electronic message center, except that electronic message centers shall be prohibited in residential districts and on lots within any locally designated historic district. And I would allow Mr. Schuman to make his case for that one.
Madam Chair. Okay.
Mr.
So obviously, some of us want to move slow on these signs. Right now, pre-amended, we would be allowing these signs in residential neighborhoods. And it may seem like there's very few opportunities for these signs in residential neighborhoods, but there's actually quite a few. There are quite a few developments with HOAs that enter and exit onto residential streets. There are several schools within residential neighborhoods. Now we can assume that no school board, at least the school board we have right now, wouldn't necessarily want to install these signs in front of their schools, but we don't know, and we don't know what future school boards would do. I personally wouldn't want to see these signs in front of places like spruce and pine, maple, birch that are on residential streets. We don't know that future school boards might want to do this. We also don't know that some of these buildings might get sold down the road, and those buildings might end up becoming private schools, charter schools, and they might want to install those signs. Also, the way it is now, not amended, apartment buildings would be able to put these signs in when they enter through where their signage is actually on a residential street. Bridalwood, Delmar Arms, there's a few others. And of course, there are 2 churches. Now, I'm not trying to run over the church here. I know this was discussed. I know you guys are all in favor of allowing the church to, the Unitarian Church to do this. But I do want people to understand that the only discussion of this so far was not before BZBA, it was actually before Landmarks. And Landmarks does not notify residents anything more than a piece of paper that you stick in your window saying you've asked for to do an alteration to your property. The issue I see here is that nobody on Porter Road knows that this is going on. Nobody on Porter Road is aware that we're about to let an electronic sign be put up on, electronic message board, whatever we call it, to be put on Porter Road. And that concerns me. The way that it works, Landmarks turned down this electronic message board. These folks have an opportunity to go to the appeals board. And now these electronic boards have been turned down in commercial districts prior to this because we have not allowed them. Now we're allowing them in commercial districts. So I think they might have a case before BZBA to have their to get what they want. BZBA would also notify the neighbors. And again, I don't think anybody on Porter Road knows about this. I haven't reached out to anybody on Porter Road. I don't know if the councilman has or not. Again, this restriction doesn't mean any of these entities would not be able to do it. It means they'd have to appeal to the Board of Zoning and Building Appeals. And at very least, we're going to let people will be allowed to know. Neighbors will know, residents will know that this is coming. And I wouldn't want to live across the street from a, say like one of the homeowners association properties, signs, and then suddenly without any warning, it becomes a message board. I want you to think about that. And that's why I'm proposing this. And I don't think this is mutually exclusive with Mr. Limpert's amendment either. I think, and I really don't have a problem with that. The only issue I really had, and I brought this up multiple times about the church's proposed sign, was the fact that it's a residential neighborhood. That's and I'll leave it to the committee.
Mr. Limpert, did you have a comment?
I do. Yeah. So I mean, I'm just seeing. I was just seeing this for the first time yesterday, and I didn't get a chance to connect with Mr. Schuman. What I don't like about the way it's written is it's saying prohibited, and if you're saying that it would require a variance, then I think it should be stated that that would have to go, shall require a variance. And I just need to think about that a little bit, because you're sort of putting BZD in a position to say, I think there needs to be some criteria then of what they should consider to permit or not permit a variance. So I don't like the way the language says it's prohibited in residential districts, because it does sound like it's mutually exclusive from, well, it's not mutually, it's just further narrowing, even beyond even beyond a landmark, just any kind of sign that's in anywhere residential. So does that mean at the top of the streets, or how are we defining residential adjacent? Or because when you mentioned apartments, so is it, Ms. Lieber, like what would we qualify that with? The top of the street, like where, let's say where Becker's Donuts used to be on top of Bretton Ridge, would that fall within a residential district and would be prohibited?
To Councilman Limper's question, so residential districts would imply the actual zoning district of the property. So if it were in a 1 and 2 family district, multiple residence district, senior residence district, those are considered residence districts. So those types of properties would not be eligible under this amendment for this type of signage.
So Madam Chair, so Ms. Lieber, the apartment building example he gave would not be zoned residential district, right?
Which apartment building specifically? Again, it's the underlying zoning. So whatever the zoning map would say, if it's a residential zoning district, then this amendment would impact that property. So, you know, in some cases we have churches in residential districts, we have churches in commercial districts. So this would mean like a school, a church, a nursing home, a daycare, or any other types of those types of uses that you sometimes find in a residential district would not be able to have a digital sign. But if they're in a commercial district on Lorraine Road or Great Northern or, you know, one of those areas, then they would. So, but it's based upon the zoning, not the use, if that makes sense. The zoning.
It does. I was just trying to better understand where like the apartment building perhaps, or a dual use would fit within a residential area.
Apartments would probably be zoned multiple residents or a residence district. We do have some apartment buildings that are in commercial districts, however. So it's possible if you have a apartment building that's and the underlying zoning is commercial or mixed use, then those would be permitted.
Thank you.
Mr. Bryan.
Thank you. I have, this is a new thing, so it hasn't been able to get out to public voice yet. So thank you for the opportunity. I think there's quite a bit of a difference between living in a residential area that, say, where St. Brendan's Church is at, in the middle of a subdivision, basically, and where our church is at, the Unitarian Church. Or even, I looked through the directory, there's a church on Clegg, there's some on Columbia, there's some on Dover Center that are in residential districts. And so, I mean, there's quite a distinction between these different residential districts. These are major roads, 35 miles an hour. And I don't think they can constitute quite a residential neighborhood. They may be full of houses, but it's still a somewhat more major road than a Bretton Ridge subdivision street, or even putting one at the Stearns Road entrance of Bretton Ridge. I grew up in that neighborhood. The other thing is, I think there should be a church exemption to the signage, because you would once again be treating some churches differently than others, and rescinding or restricting their voice differently on how they can express themselves from the other churches on the Lorraine Road churches. Thank you.
Director Lieber.
I have a concern about that, and I'm not sure if Mr. Groh has just momentarily stepped away, but we can treat different districts, like commercial districts, differently than residential districts. But we can't single out certain speakers, churches, for example, and grant them additional rights or different rights than other similarly situated types of land uses. So I'd be very concerned if we took an approach that I think that wouldn't pass constitutional muster to do it that way. So if you tie your zoning regulations to an underlying district, then I think that seems reasonable, but to pick out one particular land use specifically, I think could cause Mr. Groh some concern.
Brian.
I think you went and raised up the constitutional issue. I think the Constitution takes care of separating it and that the state can't be restricting some religions over others. I think the Constitution allowed you to separate use in this particular case of religion. Thank you.
Mr. Limpert.
Yeah, I'm not really going to respond to constitutional issues, but I guess I'm just hesitant on main thoroughfares to prevent whether that, that doesn't have to be a county route, but I'm thinking a main thoroughfare, even if it is a residential area. I just see that as different than a development. And so I think if we think about zoning, maybe we have to think about the type of residential it is. But I mean, just my initial thought would be not to, I need to think about that more before approving it.
My only concern is now you're going to categorize, you're going to take a residential district and now change your distinction of that because these residents happen to live on a main thoroughfare. And I think a residential district is a residential district. And I think that they should be treated as such, regardless of whether they have a busier street than most. It's still a residential area. That's all I have. Mr. Schuman.
Thank you. I live on one of the busiest streets in town, and it's still a neighborhood, and that's why this occurred to me. This is why it bothered me so much. Again, this doesn't. I don't think this stops them from appealing it, and I think at very least you would have an opportunity for residents to, and maybe nobody shows up. Maybe the residents don't care, but they might. And that I think if one of these were going up across the street from me or down the street from me or next door, something like that, I might be concerned. And I'm looking at it from that point of view. And I think other people, and again, I don't think anybody on Porter Road knows this is going to happen. And that's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schuman. Mr. Glassburn and then Ms. Heeman.
I think I'm more or less in the same spot as Councilman Limpert on both if we're going to proceed, there should be some clarity about, or at least some kind of hint to the folks as to how they're supposed to appeal and what the rules of the game are. That doesn't sound like a very clean piece of legislation to me, but if that's what we really intend, then I think we should put a little more thought into spelling that out. I also just, in terms of consistency, want to, remind folks that we have, residents that have, that face now into the driveways of fast food restaurants that have car lights that go directly into their living rooms. So we've dealt with similar issues like this before. It just strikes me that there may be a better way to handle this than to be just categorical on residential, but I don't have a constructive suggestion as to how that should be further refined. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say that I really agree with that. I think, the city was built in such a way as to incorporate schools and churches and all of these community things into the community, right? And so that proposes a unique challenge, I believe, is number one. Number two, I think that it does need to be very cleanly written so that there is no misinterpretation. I think, Mr. Schuman, we get into a lot of difficult situations when we rely on that. Well, we'll just go to appeal. I had a judge friend that, used to always say that, I'll just leave that to the appeals geniuses, okay? Because when stuff is tough, at some point they're like, I don't know what to do. And I think that, in our appeal process, people forget that if that resident or that business does not like the decision of the appeal, its next place is common pleas court. And I don't like that. I never have and I never will, because it doesn't come back to council. It just moves right along to litigation, which is wrong. And in particular, because we have very good volunteers that serve on those boards, but again, they're volunteers and the boards and commissions can change over time, year to year even perhaps, depending on if someone wants to continue to do that volunteer work. And so I think putting it in those hands is not the right thing to do. And I don't think it's the cleanest, most effective thing to do. And since this has been such a project for a year and a half, as Mr. Garreau has pointed out, I think it deserves, you know, the little bit more time it might take to figure out the language to be very specific and just, you know, not just dismissed to an appeal process. Thank you.
Ms. Lieber, and then Mr. Limpert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The appeal process for any zoning matter is the same for any area of the zoning code and is well defined. And the standards are established through case law for area variances. The Duncan factors are used and the board is trained in the application of those factors. So I just have to disagree that there would need to be some special appeal procedure, because there already is an appeal procedure, one that's routinely used that folks understand. And the standard of burden is on the applicant to show for area variances that there's something unique about the property that would merit the variance. So there's a different standard for use variance as there would be for an area variance. Again, area variances for signage have been granted a lot, which is one of the reasons we're trying to update this code, is to not put our business community through these appeals. But I also think community across community, I've never heard of a situation where appeals from decisions of the BZA goes to a legislative body. I think it's standard is probably a statutory thing in state law of how these bodies work and what their authority is. So again, that's probably an area for Mr. Garreau, but when it comes to appeals, I think we have all the ordinance language we need and all the procedure in place that we need and that is consistent with communities across the state. Thank you.
Yeah,
Mr. Limpert.
thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I agree completely with Ms. Lieber about not needing additional qualifiers as it relates to the appeals process. My concern was that when you go to an appeals board, you know, I've had to go for a variance for, say, fencing, but the fence was permitted. It just, there were certain parameters that were needed to be flexed versus going to an appeals board for something that says it's prohibited. That's kind of a different conversation with the board. When going in, it's prohibited versus I'm looking to try to align it with my piece of property. And that's my only concern with the language, is that it's prohibited on residential. And because of that, that's where I'm thinking, I'm not just hearing that, thinking about it in this meeting, I'm not sure I'm in favor of just prohibiting it within residentials and expecting anybody to receive a variance on that when it makes sense. I guess that's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Limpert. Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I bring this up in a later issue, but I think it's potentially relevant here. It seems to me that the core issue of these signs are their luminosity, or how bright they are. We're somewhat killing the same project from two different sides by forcing an appeals process, but also requiring a certain luminosity standard. So there are such things that, you know, we permit these signs to exist in the daytime. To me, there should be some level of brightness that is acceptable, that's not intrusive. I'm not a scientific expert to know what that is. But to me, that would be the way to resolve this, as opposed to just an outright prohibition.
Are there any further questions or comments from council before I go to the audience or our guests? Mr. Lambert, your mic's on, so I didn't know if you still wanted to speak.
Sorry.
Mr.
Thanks.
Burns. Mr. Burns.
Yes, in the proposed sign ordinance in the area concerning digital signs, it limits the color, what colors can be used for the signs themselves. And it also has regulations for the brightness that has to be less at night than during the day and that sort of thing. And I think that addresses the problem that you have with encroachment on neighbor properties and that sort of thing. And I truly believe that these residential streets we're talking about, the main streets and that, you have more illumination from headlights from passing cars than you're going to have from these digital signs. And I really think that this amendment isn't needed.
Committee, are we going to go and proceed with the vote on this one, or are we going to come back?
I don't have, Madam Chair, I don't have any other questions. If we want to vote on it, I'm voting on it.
Okay. Then I will say, as for number 3, committee, I make a
I'll
motion
second.
to adopt. Okay. This change, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Nay.
Okay, it's 2-1. Okay, as to number 4, which is to remove the flag definition, Director Lieber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our consultant had recommended in her audit of our existing code that we remove the flag section. So we did, but we had kept the definition in Chapter 1115. Mr. Glassburn's recommendation was to eliminate the definition and in Section 115.04, and I have no concern with that amendment.
Are there any questions from committee? Questions from council? Seeing none, then I will make a motion to adopt number 4 as an amendment and ask for second.
Second.
Second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, that motion passes 3-0. Number 5, increase non-commercial sign limit to 48 square feet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This proposed amendment does allow for an unlimited number of non-commercial message signs in all districts, so in commercial districts and residential districts. We did believe that there was a need to allow for something bigger than a temporary yard sign size that you would normally see, like for election signs. We thought 32 square feet was reasonable. It's typically the size of a piece of plywood. And it's also not so large as to require structural support, which tends to move it beyond temporary into something that seems to need a more permanent and stable base. So building has noted that from time to time we get complaints from residents about temporary signs larger than your typical election yard sign. And we have concerns that if we increase the size to 48 square feet, we might just continue to feel more of those concerns. So we did feel an increase was warranted, but not from 32 square feet to 48 square feet. Perhaps in reading Mr. Glassburn's comments, and he can clarify, there may have been a misunderstanding that the 32 square feet was an aggregate number and not a per sign number. But it would be a per sign number, not an aggregate square footage per lot, if that helps clarify the issue. Thank you.
Mr. Glassburn, would you like to elaborate?
Yes, precisely what Director Lieber said at the end. We've had different parts of this at different times that have had aggregates and some that are per sign. If it's 32 per sign, I have no issue.
Thank you. Any questions from committee? Any questions from council? Then I will make a motion that we include number 5. May I ask for a second?
Madam Chair, just to clarify, so, sorry, this 5 says to increase to 48. So, okay, so we're actually voting to increase it to 48, right?
How about you all consider it withdrawn?
Madam Chair?
Yes,
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Yes, Mr. Burns.
As I read your document here, it says that the recommendation is no change.
Mr. Burns, it was included as a bullet point on here, and we are going through and voting on them. So this one has now since been withdrawn.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so number 5 is not included. Correct? Okay.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on to number 6 was a recommendation to delay implementation of the standards and or parse out certain elements of the code that are perceived as more liberal versus more restrictive from Councilman Glassburn. I wanted to, in addition to Director Groh's comments before about his reasoning why adopting this updated code is important, I also wanted to point out all the ways that this code does more liberalize the application of sign regulations for businesses. Many of these changes came around because businesses asked for them, and that we've noted that there have been so many variances in certain areas over time that we needed to address this, and it's creating paperwork and applications for variances and time wasted. So some of the benefits include we are eliminating the limitation of one wall sign per building or per business unit. We're eliminating the 4-foot height restriction. We're eliminating the 100 square foot cap maximum wall sign size based upon the frontage. We're increasing permitted window signage. We're allowing for projecting signs. We're allowing for the electronic message centers. We're creating new categories of signs to help businesses with drive-throughs, including drive-through facility signs and driveway signs. And actually, and this might be a misconception, there will be more temporary sign options than in the current code, both for commercial and non-commercial speech. So when I look through the code and I try and find where I feel like we're being more conservative, you know, I don't really identify many areas where I think we are. I think, you know, we clarify the process, we articulate standards in a better way, we address the right-of-way signage more directly than we currently do. But I suppose that I personally don't see areas where I think that it's more constrictive for business that would merit holding this legislation or going through the effort to parse out section by section what those standards are. But I welcome committee and council's discussion on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Do we have comments from committee? Mr. Limpert and then Mr. Schuman.
I just think this should be addressed last, but I tend to agree that we don't want to overly prolong legislation if possible, up to the amount of time that would take to communicate changes. But this probably should be looked at after all changes are made. If this is talking about postponing the code, we should know what we're postponing. But thank you.
Mr. Schuman.
Thank you. So if I'm understanding the director correctly, if we delay this, we're actually giving less options to businesses at the end of the day. Would that be correct? So I don't know why we would want to delay this. I think we move forward on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schuman. Are there any other questions from committee? Council? I will save this one for last. We will vote on this toward the end and let the record reflect that Director Gallo and Councilman Kelly are present as well. Director, do you want to move to number 7, please? Thank you.
Sure. This recommendation is within the purpose statement to reorder item C to be the first in the list of objectives. I don't see them as a prioritized list. I suppose I just don't see a need for the change, but I'll leave that up to council committee to make that call. Thank you.
Any questions from committee? And then Mr. Glassburn. Mr. Glassburn, go ahead.
Yes, Madam Chair. If there is no harm, I do believe putting the safety concern as the first in the list, should anyone construe this list as ranked, puts us in a better position than if we have aesthetics as the first thing in the list. It's not a big issue, but I have run into this with other cases that I've been dealt with the Ohio Supreme Court, and sometimes they electively choose to interpret lists like this as prioritized if they view a conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Glassburn. Mr. Limp.
I'd just be interested in Mr. Garreau's point of view on this.
Madam Chair. Thank you. I've actually been involved in litigation where reasons that are not necessarily expressed directly in the ordinance, but actually could have been expressed in the ordinance, but which would also support the basis for what is challenged as unconstitutional action, not just the specific proffered reasons, but even other reasons that might be proffered in the course of litigation that can be used to substantiate and support a piece of legislation. The point being that it's not intended to be an exhaustive list necessarily. There can be other policy considerations, even those that aren't expressly stated. And I would tell you that I believe that it is not an exhaustive list. It is a list that is there. That is, the order of the list does not necessarily dictate the order of priority of the purpose. So I don't know that moving C to A will accomplish anything for purposes of a constitutional analysis. But it's your call. If you would like to do it, you're free to do it.
Thank you, Director. Mr. Limpert, did you have any further questions?
No, that answered it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schuman, I saw you had your hand up. No, okay. All right. Then my question to committee, do you want to proceed with this amendment or not?
Second. Yeah, I'm fine with it. Unless there's a material impact in rewriting it, I don't see the matter. So if it makes somebody feel more comfortable on council, I'm for it. Yes. Aye.
I agree.
Okay, then for the change, aye. Okay. All right. All right, 3-0 on that one. Now we're on the retain the 10-day requirement, Director.
Yes, so, and Jeff Grusenmeyer has been remarkably quiet this evening so far, so I'm about to call him into duty here. He can best explain the requirements of the OBC, and Mr. Groh can probably help chime in. Currently, we have a 10-day review period in our code, but there is a conflict with state law, and that can result in problems. And I think best to turn this over to our building official for a better explanation than I can give. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kim. It's important to kind of realize there are two aspects to any approval with a sign, or to most signs. You're talking about a zoning code right now, which is totally controlled by the city. So the zoning ordinance, size of the sign, where it can be placed, et cetera, is under total control of the city. That's a city zoning ordinance. However, signs are also the installation of a sign for most signs, unless they're a freestanding sign under 6 feet tall, and we don't get very many of those. Signs attached to buildings or anything else are governed by the Ohio Building Code also. So our current ordinance, which indicates that if they don't hear back or hear an approval, it shall automatically approved, is in direct conflict to issue a permit with the Ohio Building Code, which in fact is state law, which does not permit us to enforce as a certified building department any ordinance or any law or ruling which is in conflict with that which is required by the Ohio Building Code. So the Ohio Building Code itself, you can place a time limit or whatever else on the zoning approval, for example, what size it is, if a variance is required, et cetera, anything under the sign ordinance. But as far as issuing a permit or approval for under the Ohio Building Code, it has its own set of procedures, including the fact that we are required by state law to review applications in the time they're received. We're required by state law to review them in no more than 30 days, so they have an automatic appeal process. And there's also an appeal process and timing and a complaint system set up directly with the state of Ohio for any of the situations that may occur with issuing a permit when the permit is governed or the plan of approval is governed by the Ohio Building Code. So quite simply, we need to eliminate wording which is in there, which is in conflict, which would direct us to automatically approve or time limit beyond that which is allowed by the Ohio Building Code, simply because it would be in conflict. It wouldn't be permitted by state law.
Thank you, Mr. Grusenmeyer. Are there any other questions from committee? Council? Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a problem with correcting anything that is in conflict with state law. The only point I was trying to address, and quite frankly, this is the point that I spent the least amount of time on, is just that if there was a time constraint put there before to review these, I don't see why it wouldn't be still of some use to have a reasonable amount of time, whatever that amount of time is. It appeared that it was just becoming open-ended. But if it's addressed somewhere else, I'm open to that being addressed somewhere else.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
just from a building official Grusenmeyer's comments on top of that, just to say from a standpoint of a First Amendment analysis, I think that the additional time is okay. I don't think that it presents any type of a particular infirmity in the code because it involves speech. That increasing from 10 days to 30 days or some sort of a review process that takes 30 days, considering the OBC, considering the everything from the lighting code to the building code to the structural review of architectural renderings, things of that nature, and the safety considerations. There really, I don't believe, is a First Amendment concern either. If the applicant meets the criteria of the sign code and the OBC, they're going to get their permit. It's just a matter of making sure that there's sufficient time for the building official to do that, and it doesn't present a constitutional. He's speaking to code issues. I'm just speaking to the constitutional side of things. I think it passes muster.
Are there any additional questions or comments from council or committee? All right, well, seeing none, then I'll make a motion then to make no change.
Second.
And ask for a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Okay, that passes with 3-0. Okay, number 9.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Number 9 deals with the recommendation to remove the requirements and regulations on the frequency of message change and also the restrictions on the color for electronic message centers. I've said electronic message centers so many times, it's a very difficult phrase to say tonight. I wish we had a shortcut, digital sign, I guess. But I do believe that digital signs, they do have a potential to impact the aesthetics of the community, the visual impact of our commercial corridors. And I would recommend taking a conservative approach, knowing that we can always go further and allow more. But other communities have successfully implemented a transition into digital sign using fairly conservative requirements of one color and one change per day. Westlake is an example I used before, where those rules are in place and are successful. And as we make this transition from static signs to movable signs, What I don't want to have happen is we allow all sorts of change, all sorts of movement, all sorts of color, and then decide that that's not what we intended, that we don't like the end result of how that looks in the community, because we can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like once, even if we were to amend the code at that point to become more restrictive, anything existing at the time of the code change is already grandfathered. So I would just urge council to perhaps approach this more cautiously, and then perhaps plan a time after we see some signs have been constructed in the community to maybe reevaluate and take a look at if we feel that those restrictions continue to be appropriate, knowing that these signs are built to have, you know, a lot of different functionality, and so fairly easily they could be changed from a single color to operate in a different manner. They're very sophisticated digital reader boards these days. So that would be my recommendation, but it's up to council committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn and then Mr. Limpert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I see this as kind of two buckets of issues. On the question of the changing of the message, you know, very prominently at Dover Center and Lorraine, City Hall has a message board that changes its message every 15 seconds. I don't see how we can tell the community that that is a danger, given that we've had that for some considerable amount of time now. In terms of the color question, we have prohibitions on flashing. We have we have restrictions on how bright this is. I'm red-green colorblind. Colors don't really get to me one way or another, to be honest. So this may be a philosophical disagreement where I'm in the minority. I'm much more adamant about the first, but I don't see where I think there's some difference between a single color ever and, you know, crazy swirling images that are flashing and looking like Las Vegas. I think there's somewhere in between, and we can maybe start a little further down that road without being getting over our skis on this. So I'll just lastly, we've had especially with these gas station signs, we've had these different colored LEDs for 40 years. So I'm not sure where we're going with the single specific color. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glassburn. Mr. Limpert and then Mr. Schuman.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I'm definitely in favor of the stark conservative approach, and I think the stipulations we made were one of the reasons why I disagreed with the idea of preventing the residential areas, because we are being extremely conservative and sensitive to what's permissible. And then in the future, if there were more expansion of those capabilities, then maybe there is when you have a conversation about how it affects residents. So you know, I'm in favor of the approach here to start conservative and you know, expand out as these become more prevalent. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Limpert. Mr. Schuman.
I'm in total agreement with what Mr. Limpert just said. Thank you.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Lieber, can you be more specific about the, you know, message change? You know, because our city sign does change. Although it doesn't change, I mean, it's like a rolling message, right? It's a rolling message of 4 things or 3 things, whatever's going on that day, the shredding, the this, the that, versus, you know, are you talking about it's one message all day, you know, not a rolling like we have? And why would we be offended by someone else having what we have? I don't understand that. Thanks.
So yes, so the city does have a digital sign, and when it was installed, I remember having the conversation with other city officials that this would certainly draw attention and interest by our businesses and wanting the similar treatment, but that the city is exempt from its zoning code. And so we sometimes build and construct and do and improve property that we don't allow others to do. And that's just part of being a government and owning property and having a public purpose to conveying information out there in the world. So the change would be one change per 24-hour period that could potentially be increased over time. And it's something that when there's one sign changing, that has an impact on the community in one way. And if you have a row of commercial businesses that all have digital signs with unlimited ability to change, to change colors, to animate, that I think it could create, I think that, Vegas was kind of maybe far-fetched from what I think would likely happen, but certainly it's something that could be a driver distraction with multiple commercial properties in a row, changing at different times, brightness levels. So again, just taking a conservative approach, not that we'll never get to a point where there might be an allowance for a greater sign change or a greater message change, but not knowing exactly what that frequency should be to start. We're taking cues from what other communities have done successfully and what's been defensible and what has worked, and modeling after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the follow-up. I get the whole color distraction and that you don't want things changing colors, flashing and all of that. But, if you're a business or a church or something like that, and you want to say, Saturday is this, Sunday is that, just kind of like we do, I don't find that necessarily very distracting, nor do I think we should be above a criteria just because we're the government. I think that portion of it should maybe be restricted to how many messages can roll in a day, or whatever that particular business might need. I completely understand the color, right, and all the flashing and this and that. And I mean, sometimes people are not even sure where the fire truck is coming from when you start to see the flashing. But I just don't agree with the limiting of one message, since we don't limit ourselves and we don't feel it's a distraction. Thank you.
Mr. Limpert.
I'd be more inclined for us to limit what we do than trying to, because we did a sign years ago that enabled this, to then just allow everybody to do it. I mean, that's, every now and then, I remember years ago, I think there was a sign up at the corner of Lorraine and the mall that had lights and movement, and I remember trying to look and see the weather change or the time change, or maybe it was just the clock. But I don't see any harm in starting with a slow approach. And if we have concerns about what we do, then we can certainly, write some letters to our sign maintenance thing to try to align with our own code, as opposed to just bringing everybody else up to what we do because we do it. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Limpert. Mr. Schuman.
And then was that the community building that had that sign on it? I remember that. Actually, I find our sign incredibly distracting because I always try to read it when I'm driving, and I find it very distracting. And I know I'm getting old, and I'm not alone. So, I worry about what the world's going to look like down the road. Thank you.
It was easier to read that sign before all of the traffic light changes. Are there any additional questions from council? All right, well then, seeing none, then I'm going to make a recommendation that we make no change at this time and ask for a second.
Second.
Okay, seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, and that's no change, 3-0. And off to number 10.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Notwithstanding the discussion in relation to vehicle signs and the temporary COVID policy, this is specifically in relation to the permanent sign regulations. I oppose this amendment that would remove any restriction on vehicular signs. They're currently prohibited, and I don't believe that this update is particularly more restrictive. It's just more descriptive about what constitutes a vehicle sign. I would like to imagine that if commercial establishments are allowed to have any type of vehicle sign parked in front of their establishment without repercussion, it's, we have a temporary sign ordinance for a reason, to try and have consistency and continuity in our commercial district and a certain cohesiveness. And this could very much disrupt that, to potentially have every commercial business with any type of vehicle parked, trailer parked, car wrapped sign on top of a car. Some of these signs have actually become things that we've received the most complaints about in history of zoning complaints related to signage. In the past, I remember a trailer being parked at Stearns and Lorraine with signage on it that was a source of complaint. Mr. Grohl likes talking about the fish store sign. But I do think this would have a negative impact on community aesthetic, and it would really, I think, undermine our permanent sign code by allowing any vehicle to now serve as sign face area in an unrestricted manner. So while I might understand council has different ideas of what's appropriate during a pandemic, I feel in terms of our permanent sign code that we need to continue the prohibition that currently exists on vehicle signs. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Are there any questions from committee? Okay. Councilwoman Heeman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Lieber, can you explain, so for example, a business has a food truck, let's say, okay? And that is, parked just generically in their parking lot or in the space in front of their business. What currently restricts or does not restrict that right now? Thanks.
Let me find that section. I had it highlighted, anticipating this conversation might come up. Okay, so vehicular signs are currently prohibited, and they're defined. Vehicular signs shall mean any sign attached or applied to a vehicle of any type and used primarily to identify, advertise, or promote, excluding any signs on vehicles normally and regularly used and operated in the course of business. So currently, our definition would say if you have a food truck and it has signage attached to it, but it moves, it goes out to events, and it's just housed at this property, that does not constitute a vehicle sign, because that vehicle is in use in the business, comes, goes. It's not simply there for the purpose of advertising. So a food truck would be permitted presently and under the adopted new code.
Ms. Heeman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what then is, the ability to park those wherever somebody wants to park them? What's the prohibited parking of those? Meaning, can they just, it has to be in front of their particular business. It has to be, they can just put it down in another parking lot further down the mall. They can put it, how do you regulate a food truck being put somewhere on someone's premises? Well, I guess my point, what I'm driving at here, is that's almost like, free advertising that somebody can have if they make that investment and another person can't. And I get the reason that you're wanting to prohibit the signs on trucks. Like I get that totally. I just want to make sure though that, there's not a claim that, you're favoring a business that has a food truck and they can just park it wherever they'd like to. It has to be so many feet from their front door. Like if you could enlighten me and educate me about that criteria. Thanks.
We don't have criteria other than it would need to be parked in a legal parking space, not in a loading zone, not obstructing a drive aisle or a fire lane. Any legitimate parking space on the property of the business could be used for parking of a vehicle that might also have signage on it for that business, so long as it's in use for the business. Now, if we had an off-site business parking a vehicle in a property where they didn't have a bricks and mortar presence, then I think we would potentially have the ability to say that, you know, this vehicle is unrelated to a business at this property, and therefore it's being parked solely for the purpose of advertising and not because it is customarily used in the day-to-day operations of the business. So I guess that's what my reaction and response would be to the potential of a vehicle being parked elsewhere.
Ms. Human.
Thank you. One more. Okay, so we also then don't regulate what type of truck that is, right? So how do you tell somebody not to buy a van and let's just paint something on it and park it there? I mean, it fits that criteria since we really don't have any regulation or other criteria for that quote catering or food or whatever truck you want to call it. How do you, then determine that this one's okay and that one would not be, and it can't be a matter of judgment? Do we include that in this, piece of work that we're doing now, or do we amend another piece of work to address that, somebody wants to sort of skirt around that, and now I'm just gonna paint a truck and put it out there and call it my food truck or whatever they do. And I hope I'm not being too tedious, but I think this is the opportunity. We've been told to do it now or kind of hold our tongues. Thank you.
I think it would get too far into regulations to start dictating exactly what types of vehicles specifically could be used by a business for their operations. Some may have vans, some may have trucks. We've certainly seen a variety of sizes and shapes of vehicles. So, the new code has a little bit more language around this about vehicles or trailers being parked continuously in one location to be used primarily as signage. And then it talks about exemptions, like, if a vehicle is parked at a driver's residence, that's the primary means of transportation, that doesn't constitute a vehicle sign. Fleet and delivery vehicles, or, a vehicle that would be personal means of transportation. So maybe if you're the Mally's pink car, if you won that contest and you're driving that car around. So I think, and Mr. Grusemeyer can chime in if he feels appropriate, that there's always some investigation if there's a complaint made or an observation made by an inspector of what is the nature of the complaint, what is the vehicle, what is the business, how long has it been here, has it moved, did you talk to the manager to understand the nature of the vehicle. But trying to put more rules around the exact type of vehicle or the exact placement of parking, I think we could get too far down the rabbit hole in terms of those regulations, because not every property might be set up to have, a back part of the lot or, a service area of the lot where a vehicle could be stored. So I would hesitate to get into rules around, if there's a legitimate parking space, then if it's not a vehicle sign, if it's a sign that just happens to be attached to a vehicle that doesn't meet this definition, then I think it should be able to go in any legitimate parking space. And Mr. Grusemeyer, I know we've had these conversations. I don't know if you have more input on this particular issue that would be illuminating.
No, I think you've handled it well. I just would state, yes, if a complaint comes in, we'd have to investigate the veracity of the complaint, see basically and be able to establish that the vehicle, in fact, was not used, regularly as a delivery vehicle or some other similar requirement of the ordinance before we could take action to cite them for having such a sign. Generally, they're pretty clear. I mean, people. My experience with vehicle signs has been that they people look at them as a way around to escape the bounds of an ordinance to have a lot more signage in their lot or what have you. It's not because, they're looked upon as a loophole, more or less, quite often. So if they obviously obtain a vehicle or whatever nature it is and station it there, we would have to investigate and establish reasonably that we could testify in court. We had a reasonable belief that in fact it's not used in their business. Now, if they could establish it was and it leaves the site, et cetera, that would have to be taken into account. But certainly that's something that we would have to investigate at the time that complaint came in. Thank you.
Mr. Schuman.
If we were to lift this restriction, somebody could potentially just, and I guess I'm asking Jeff or Kim here, if we were to lift this, then somebody could just buy a truck and put a wrap on it with their business logo and just leave it in front of for more signage. And that's what we're trying to stop. Correct? A truck that has nothing to do, has no real use for their business. Correct? Thank you.
If you're asking, yes, that would be correct. You could buy the back end of a semi trailer and park it in front of your business and paint the thing top to bottom, left or right with anything, and it would be just additional advertisement. Correct.
Okay, so then we remove, or we more clearly define this section and say that you can't have a semi-trailer truck or box cart or any other, instance like that. But if you have a truck or a vehicle that does occasionally leave the property to make deliveries, and is used for advertisement, on a property that is privately owned, or not, I just think that we have business owners in this community that are respectful. They abide by our rules. We have a COVID time right now where any additional signage is much needed. And I think that putting any further restrictions is just, could possibly be detrimental to their business. And I feel very strongly about this portion of this code. As stated earlier, I would like to see us work on something that could very well stay in the code that would permit this, not on a 365-day basis, but as an occasional sign usage. Thank you. Mr. Glassberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And that gets to more what I was getting at as well. I'm not a fan of these creative uses. My concern is that the equity of enforcement issue, but secondly, if you have a large panel van and you paint your business name on it, I don't see how material different that is than a pickup truck that has a banner that's tied to it. One is much less desirable in terms of aesthetics, but they're really very similar things. And the tighter we squeeze on this area, the more we may push into aggressive, we may be regulating our way into getting more aggressively awful things, trying to get around these. That's my concern.
And I understand too, that we don't want these vehicles using this as their core signage for the business. And we also don't want to have dilapidated vehicles or inoperable or, pretty much a junk car with a sign slapped on the side. I mean, that's not what we're asking for, but again, we have, instances where we could lessen up this restriction and figure out a way to make it work. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with you on that, because one of the things we have to keep in mind here is we have, chain businesses, very large chain businesses with very large cash available to them. We have small businesses that just don't have, the ability to have, the laid out, tricked out big truck that they want to deliver or take food to an event or do something or deliver their product, whatever that product is. And I think looking at that, we have to accommodate both as they coexist in our community. So I would like to see something like that, Madam Chair. I think it's a good way to approach, the small business and the large business and treat them equally. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schuman.
so I'm a little confused here. So as it reads right now with the new sign code, we will be allowing businesses to have a vehicle that they use for delivery, for whatever, for receiving goods, for moving people around, whatever, but actually used as part of the business to be decorated with their signs. But what we don't allow is all those things that we were just talking about: inoperable vehicles, a truck trailer, vehicles that are just there specifically to be a sign. That's what we don't allow. Maybe Director Lieber could.
Correct.
So I'm real comfortable with that. I think that's a good place to be. I think that's what we should be doing. We don't want a bunch of vehicles parked with wraps on them, and we don't want to have. I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. A small business can take a vehicle and they could put a wrap on it with their business. The bagel place could have a bagel vehicle that either delivers or is the manager's vehicle that he drives home at night. Correct? That'd be acceptable. And so, I mean, so that's good. But if they bring a different vehicle up and they buy a panel van and they put stuff in, they're not using it or anything, they just have it sitting in the parking lot, then they're not abiding by what we have. And so that'd be good. I think that's a good place to be.
Director.
So I'd never like negotiating against myself, but it sounds like there's several members of council that are looking for a little bit of a relief valve on this issue. And there's an area where I think that relief valve could potentially happen that doesn't involve deep diving into this code section and rewriting it. So within the current proposed temporary sign regulations, there is a section, signs allowed for a restricted time. And these are temporary signs that do require a sign permit, and they're allowed on a restricted time basis, in addition to those that are otherwise allowed. And so it's 30 days, twice per year. There's a maximum square footage per lot. And currently the permitted types are yard signs and banner signs. Now, if council wanted to allow sometimes of year or for special events, if you added the permitted types of vehicle signs into that specific section, then that would be a way of having a special event or a one-time thing or a sale or like some kind of occurrence where they could get a permit for a time-limited duration where we're not then allowing them year-round on every property and opening the floodgates. So that would be, again, not trying to negotiate against myself since I don't support it, but if you were going to do it, I think that place would give the city some control and review of those signs and would result in maybe a better outcome.
Thank you, Director. Ms. Ham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that, comes to mind, and it's just something I'd like to point out perhaps, is that it's the type of business and it's relative to, in part, the type of tools they need for their business. Like there's a little scooter shop in Lakewood. Well, guess what? They really do deliver scooters on trailers. That's how they deliver them, unless I guess you come and pick it up at their little store and drive it home. So they do have a trailer, and I'm not saying we want trailers, but I'm just saying that that's a relative item to their type of business. Now, we don't happen to have a business like that here in North Olmsted, but we could. So I guess that's, what I really am trying to be clear on here. When you're saying you don't want a tractor trailer, you can't have this, can't have that. Well, what if then they need that for their business? And I understand the idea behind, what we don't perhaps want parked in a business or a lot or somewhere. I happen to actually live in a homeowners association where we are not permitted to park our cars in our driveways overnight. Like I can't put my car in my driveway. That's restrictive, right? But I do it. So I don't, and it's for the reasons that we're kind of saying, we don't want this, that. So I just don't want to be boxed in. I'd like to see, you know, the little bit more broad, I suppose, to make sure that we don't have to go back and try to debate this one again. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, you guys are gonna have to toss a coin to see who goes first, because Schumann and Lieber had their hands up at the same time.
Okay, I will allow the director to go first if she'll accept it.
How kind, Mr. Schumann. And just to reiterate that if any vehicle is in use for the normal operations of the business, then that is not considered a vehicle sign. So if we were so fortunate to get a little scooter shop that had a trailer and they wanted signage on it and they were using it, that would be acceptable.
But what if they only used it maybe one day a week or once every 2 weeks? Is
It would
that
be
gonna
for the
different?
business. No,
So
not.
if you make deliveries out of a 4-panel truck, or however you want to describe it, if they're doing catering deliveries or delivering food to a community center or something like that, is that still considered part of the business, or is that vehicle now in violation because perhaps their sign might change when they go out for their delivery? I'm just putting out the scenarios because they're there.
It seems to me that that would be a vehicle that has signage and the vehicle is used in the normal course of business. And again, you know, when Mr. Grusenmeyer mentioned the investigative process, that's when you uncover, you know, if they're like, well, we use this to deliver goods, but we only do it twice a year. Well, that's one thing. But if it's once a week, we're not, you know, going to be telling somebody that they can't park a vehicle that they need for pickups or drop-offs once weekly. That doesn't seem reasonable to me.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I'm still. I think that the idea of the temporary permit is actually a pretty good one to add that, vehicles to that. Maybe you and the Director Garreau can come up with like a list of vehicles or whatever. As long as they're doing it temporary. I mean, people could take old cars or something like that. If somebody wants to do something creative, I got no problem with that, but I wouldn't want it to be a permanent thing. And I think it's spelled out clearly enough about the, you know, what's acceptable and what's not. You're always going to have people that are going to break rules no matter how tightly you write them. So people are going to try to get around. There's always going to be somebody. Most of the business people will abide by it because they want to be good neighbors. They want to be good business neighbors. So they're not going to push it too much. Certainly, but I mean, and again, we have people doing the investigation. They're going to find out what's really going on. And sometimes just a little, you know, hey, you know, you're not supposed to do this kind of stuff will stop people from doing it. But the temporary thing, I think that might be a good idea. That might be very acceptable. Thank you.
You're on mute, Madam Chair.
Well, I thought everybody liked me that way. Thank you. Are there any additional questions from committee or council? Then is the committee in agreement that perhaps we ask Director Lieber and Director Garreau to come up with language to enhance this portion?
No. I thought the recommendation was around the exception language and not this part of the code. My recommendation would be to keep this part of the code the same and add some stipulations about vehicles as part of the extended exception process, is the way I understood the conversation. Mr. Schumann, is that where you stood?
I agree with that. Yes. Wait, to not remove the vehicle signage restrictions that are in the new sign code, but to ask for some adjustment to the temporary signage to include vehicles.
Okay, so then how is this amendment made? Are we just going to amend the temporary signage then? So we'll take number 10 and,
No, nay,
No,
I'm voting nay.
no, we're going to, wait a minute, now I'm confused. We're going to take number 10 and turn that to
Or 9,
add,
10. Yeah,
oh my
stop
God,
talking, Dwayne.
I'm stopping.
to, see, now you just have me lost for words. To move vehicles into the, thank you, Director Lieber, yes, thank you, help me.
I feel like motion you're trying to make is to leave the vehicle sign section as is and to add vehicle signs as a permitted temporary sign type under the time restricted commercial sign
Yes.
section.
Yes.
That we can do.
Mr. Schuman, was that a motion?
Yeah, we'll call that a motion.
Second. Oh, wait, Madam Chair has to make that, right?
Yeah, but the director, just let him go because it's not valid now. Go ahead. He's not even the vice chair.
Right.
All right, so then I'll make the motion based on Director Lieber's. However, here's my question now. If it goes into the temporary sign code, then how does this work with the vehicle restrictions?
We will make it work through the power of code language that our law director will help craft. So we'll have the notwithstanding the prohibition in 1163, whatever, we'll add some fancy stuff that makes it clear it's a singular exception in that one location of the code.
But then are we going to regulate how many times per year or, and then are we going to give them the exemption during COVID?
Madam Chair, so we already have standards for how many days, times of year, and all that included. So we can draft it and circulate it to committee for your feedback. So it seems like kind of a potential easy fix. And then the temporary regulations are something completely different. That
Okay.
if the temporary would supersede anything currently in place.
Okay. All right. All right, then and then as for number 10, then we'll place those, the vehicle signage and move that to the temporary area and then, is that right? Okay. Are we all in favor on that? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Okay. So long as there's a relief process. Okay. All right, and then we'll just move on to number 11.
I need to direct this one to Law Director Guro.
Madam Chair, if I may?
Certainly, thank you.
Is this the, I'm working off of two different lists. This is the right-of-way one?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. In the question of regulating a right-of-way, as we currently have it in our, let me pull it up. Forgive me for a minute while I'm pulling this up. Gotta find it. We currently have a zero signage policy within the public right-of-way, with the exception of government signs, which would be the obvious speed regulation signs, things of that nature, street signs, directional signs. And the only other signage is permitted is public utility emergency signage is permitted in the right-of-way. We have a clear definition of right-of-way in the code as well. So as it's written The right of way is not and has never been considered a forum for speech. It's not a traditional forum. It's not a non-traditional forum. It's not a forum at all. It's not a place to conduct speech. As I pointed out, we most oftentimes see temporary signs kind of dropped in the right of way. When we see them, they're enforced. I know that Mr. Grusenmeyer could testify to that fact. I think we've got service department people generally that end up removing them because they're the ones out and about driving around. They find them. But we do enforce that pretty strictly. When we find signage in the right of way, it's removed. It's not permitted. The right of way is that area which is defined in the code. So it's pretty tight as it is. So it's kind of, as it's written, it's solid. Maybe there was another angle to it that I wasn't seeing when I answered that question.
Thank you, Director. Mr. Glassburn.
So we have this policy in two places. We have the definition of the right of way, which is in the 15 section, and then we have the signs that are permitted in, in a different section. But the way we address this is we say, we can have government signs, we can have road signs. We don't say what we can't have. And I understand why that would be an all-encompassing list. I'm just looking for a easier way to point to folks, to tell folks to say, this line here, don't put signs in the right of way. Something that is more concise and easier to explain to the public than, well, under definition 15 and in section 35 or whatever the numbers are, we say what signs are permitted. That's all.
Director Lieber, you have your hand up.
And Mr. Groh maybe didn't express this quite as directly, but the section says signs shall be prohibited in the right of way with the exception of. So I think that's kind of clear that it's limiting everything. Nothing can be here except for these traffic signs, basically. And I think I probably mentioned this at a last meeting where we talked about right of way, like right of way to city staff or any agency of the city enforcing the sign code is a very understood space. So the city staff enforcing this understands what that space is. The education process of letting others know what that is, we can certainly explain and describe, but we want to avoid saying things like tree lawn because they're not always equal to, and we don't want to create confusion where, sometimes sidewalks fall on private property, sometimes in public property. So, I think sticking with rights of way, even though for some it's like an unfamiliar term, but it's a very specific term to those who enforce the code. And I think, that's important in a bright line. So I like having that language in there. And again, education is another matter, but I'm not sure how it could be better expressed in the code without creating the potential for greater confusion that might already exist. Thank you.
Mr. Glassburn, did you have follow-up on that? No?
Not really, Madam Chair. The other point that I made in the comment was just to know what exactly our plan would be to enforce this moving forward, or if that's changing, because in previous meetings we've said there hasn't been much enforcement, and at different times other folks in the administration have said there's plenty of enforcement. So I would actually like to see more enforcement from a personal view, but that was the other component of this. Thank you.
Director Lieber, and then Mr. Schuman.
I think this new section is our building official's favorite amendment to our entire sign code. His frustration with enforcement has been that he could not issue immediate removal, that he had to provide notice and follow the other provisions of the code. So it's not that there wasn't enforcement, but if you have to, who do you notify when something is in the public right of way that's not necessarily put there by the adjacent property owner? So this allows now for the immediate removal. We don't have to try and notify the sign holder or the adjacent property owner that may not have put the sign there to begin with. It could have been a third party that came by and stuck something in the right of way. So I think, and just because of that number 2 under H, that is the key to how this section will be better enforced in the future than it could have been. And Jeff, if I misspoke or you want to add, please correct me or chime in.
Yes, that's correct. Before we had 48 hours. In addition, I don't know, definitions aside, I mean, it's pretty well understood. Most people, I think, realize they can't place a sign in anywhere but their own property. It's as simple as that. So if they're wandering off their property and wanting to stick a sign somewhere, they probably shouldn't. But having said that, yes, we actively, building department actively, we've requested our inspectors to remove them when they see them in the public right of way. There's currently, for temporary signs, there is some language about giving 24-hour notice, et cetera. I wanted to make it clear that in public right of ways, it can be immediately removed. And also that there's no grace period even for temporary signs on private property, that they're simple, they can be removed immediately. But one of the issues we run into is that people tend to realize that after 5 o'clock on a Friday and before 8 in the morning on Monday morning, there may not be an inspector driving around in a car who's going to yank that thing out of the ground, maybe except for me, because I drive around on the weekends and sometimes do that. But so I don't know about enforcement. In general, yes, we will fairly aggressively be pulling out those from the public right of way. The issue becomes yes, weekend enforcement or off hours enforcement's another matter. And there is kind of a word out there that yes, if I stick up a bunch of signs on Saturday, they may not catch me before Monday morning when I can take them back down. So the weekends, they tend to sprout up a little bit more, but we can probably address that too if we get more into it. We may, in the past, we have had times where we've approved some overtime, some limited overtime on the weekends and things to go out and do a little better enforcement on those things. We've just been, a number of circumstances recently, we have been, and as Michael has informed you, we've been less than aggressive in the same manner. So any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. Mr. Schuman.
So real quick, why can't we have the police out on the weekends picking them up? Is that something that I seem to remember years ago that they used to do that? I'm sure that was may have been before my time on council, but I can remember that there were a couple times, and sometimes it was political signs. And I know for a fact that the highway patrol will pick them up on the highways right away on occasion too, on on-ramps and stuff. So it is an issue, and it is a big thing for businesses and politicals to put them out on a Friday, hoping that they'll be out over the weekend. So I just wondering why we couldn't just have the police doing it too. Maybe they don't want to, but it's something they can, I mean, just an option.
Yes, if I could answer that. We're more than happy to have the assistance of service police and anyone else who will do it. I believe they're certainly legally permitted to do it, and I'll defer to the law director if he has an opinion on it. But yes, we're certainly would be welcome any assistance from the police service or whatever else. It's just that we have not always received that in the past. And I'm not sure what the policy is with the police department or service department. So.
Mr. Schuman, go ahead.
Just one more thing. I think that saying the city or saying the right of way is fine. I think if somebody ever asks me what the right of way is, it's usually from the sidewalk over, but sometimes it's not. That's what I'll tell them. I think it's pretty obvious to most people. Once you tell them that they can't put it on their tree lawn or put it on somebody else's tree lawn. So I think that's pretty clear. Thank you.
You would be surprised.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
In my experience, I think we can agree that a lot of times it's for sale by owners. They put them down at the corner. There's an open house for some event, so they stick it on the corner, or they actually put it onto a telephone pole. I know that we've I think Mr. Grusemeyer could whether it's a temporary sign stuck in the ground or a temporary sign stuck on something else, a stop sign, a road sign, any direction signs, pretty much anything in the right of way, it's going to get removed. It's not supposed to be there. But I think we kind of know, them when you see them because they tend to pop up.
Did he freeze?
For a lot of times it's the for sale by owners and real estate. But in terms of I'm back.
Gotta love this technology.
I think you need to repeat all of that
I
because
will
you
repeat. I will repeat nothing. I have nothing further to say. In the beginning, no, I'm not. I'm done.
Well, here's the question. So if someone does post a sign, they can be removed. Okay, he disappeared. He's gone. Is that what
I'm
you're
here, but I'm here, but my screen's still frozen, so I can't see who's talking and who's moving. So, what was your question again?
saying? Perhaps you need to get new internet service at home to accommodate this new technology. I
Well,
had to.
I
I
need
had
less.
to.
I need less teenagers eating up the bandwidth. Is the
Okay.
problem? What was your
So
question?
if someone had a garage sale sign, so you can take those down if they post them on a telephone pole or anything like that?
They're in the right of way. They've been removed.
Okay, so then, the person sometimes, people doing the garage sales may not know what the right of way means.
Well, I think that, but I think most people have a common understanding that you can't stick signs all over a telephone pole, or you just dump a sign in at the corner intersection next to the stop sign. I think most people have an understanding that you can't do that. This isn't a matter of putting it in front of your own house in the tree lawn. This is putting it down the street in front of somebody else's. I mean, when I sold my house, I had to go down and ask the neighbor if I could put a little temporary sign on an open house on their property, and they said yes. I mean, that's what happens.
So then how would our building officials know that those folks were granted permission to place that sign there?
Well, when I in the situation I described, it wasn't in the right of way. It was on somebody else's property, and it was outside the right of way on a corner lot. And I said, "Hey, can I put a sign here for 3 hours explaining that my house, I'm having an open house?" They said, "Sure." So
If I could, we do not remove signs from private property.
no,
We
yeah,
only,
right,
we only physically remove them from the public right of way.
right.
Right. So if someone, in general, if someone sticks a sign in your front yard, you may remove it. We may knock on your door and ask you to remove it, but we're not going to physically go on the property and remove the sign. We'd only do so from a public right of way.
Understood.
Right.
Mr. Glassburn or Mr. Grover, did you have another comment?
No, I'm still frozen here, but I can hear you. I have I have no other comment.
Okay, Mr.
There are
Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are a handful of incidents, though, that are fairly obvious when, every Halloween, Lorraine Road, all of a sudden, every landowner coincidentally decided to support a specific candidate. I mean, or, coincidentally, every house next to the Clegg Road or Great Northern Ramp all of a sudden supports, cash for houses or whatever the thing is. So I don't know. I mean, we can't do anything on any private property.
Madam Chairwoman, yeah, we don't. In terms of, again, if it's, you always wonder when you see, the random vacant lot has 15 political signs in it, and you're left to scratch your head and wonder, but we won't go on there and remove them from the property. No. In some of the ones concerning, like along the highway, there's a different code section that applies. It wouldn't be our code section. There's a right-of-way code section that deals with the highway, and we don't go on the highway to remove the signs at the corner of Clegg and 480 exit ramp, which we don't. So no, we do not have a situation where we would ever go onto private property, to remove a sign, unless we had a court order to do it or something, which we would very, very highly unlikely ever have.
Okay. Do we have any suggested, how do we even make this recommendation, Director Garreau?
I think we're pretty good as it's written right now. I feel comfortable. I mean, it constitutionally, it's firm. It's fine. It's stating that, as Director Lieber pointed out, the signs there are no signs permitted in the right of way. Maybe there's a little bit of education required about what the right of way is, which if that's the case, we could look at that. But as it's written, I think it's okay. There's only two types of signs, governmental signs and utility signs when there's emergency work being done. That's it. Other than that, no signs.
Okay. All right, so then no other suggestions? Okay, so then no change, as is nothing, right?
I mean, it's okay by me. It's up to if you folks want to tinker with it, that's always up to you. But from the standpoint of its adequacy, I think it's good as it is. But ultimately it's your discretion. But I think it's okay as it is.
I don't have any suggestions coming in, so I will just proceed then as it stands.
Is that a motion?
Do I need one?
I don't know.
I'll take one. Okay, motion to leave it as stands, as it
Second.
is. No change. Second, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Thank you. Now, did we also needed to review number 1 and number 6 again? Which one do you want to tackle first?
Madam Chair, number 1. And so I thought we were addressing that as part of I think you mentioned about the vehicle, so I guess I would leave it to you, but the question would be, would adding that to the temporary component satisfy what you were looking for? Because otherwise I'm comfortable with the way we talked about, except for the vehicle ordinance part, or the vehicle signage part.
So the vehicle signage that I had proposed was was during the pandemic. But I also was hoping that the amendment that we made before was actually going to go into an area where there could be relief outside of the pandemic as well. Am I correct in assuming that from earlier?
Yeah, Madam Chair, so I thought that was a separate part. That was a non-pandemic part that you were talking about with the vehicle signs in the 30 days.
Yes.
So that's part of the code. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I would say then that we don't need to allow for vehicle signage as part of COVID any different than, so currently it's not permitted. Post code is not permitted with the exception of these applications for 30-day periods. So my thought would be that we wouldn't allow it during COVID for permissible signage, and assuming that we pass the next part, then it would be in play as part of the sign code to be able to do it as part of an application process. So that's my thought in the way we'd vote this. So I guess I'd be looking for confirmation from Director Garreau and Ms. Lieber on that. That I'm thinking about this the right way.
What my intent is to relieve some of this burden that this pandemic has placed on these businesses and allowing them to utilize the signage on their vehicles, I would have no problem stating in here that, you know, this change would not allow semi trucks or trailers or, you know, any ridiculous vehicle that, you know, we put in restrictions that the vehicles must be operable, have valid license plates, and be used in some course of this business's operations, rather than just, you know, a vehicle parked out front and not doing anything.
My thought would be that they would just apply for the 30-day event or whatever that we were talking about to have that vehicle signage as part of the code.
Well, along with allowing additional temporary signage, I wanted to have the vehicle portion included in here, where we're giving relief to some of these businesses through this temporary COVID policy. Mr. Garreau, you're muted. Can't hear you, you're muted.
I was trying to be muted. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I was talking to somebody else. I wasn't talking to you.
Well, you weren't frozen anymore.
I
Director
have no
Lieber,
idea.
Just to point out, one aspect of the proposed COVID policy is to waive the permit requirement. So it wouldn't necessarily waive the duration requirement, but it would make it easier for the business. They wouldn't have to go through a permit process. So I just want to point that out. That's part of the COVID relief policy. But I hear what Councilman Limpert's saying, and I hear what Councilwoman Williamson's saying. I think you're saying separate things slightly. It sounds like Mr. Limpert just wants to go with the application of the new permanent code for temporary signage, and Councilwoman Williamson wants to just allow vehicle signage more open-ended, except for certain instances of tractor trailers, et cetera. So I think that's what I'm hearing is the conflict, and I wasn't sure if we were all getting there, so I wanted to say what I was hearing and hope to just add some clarity. Maybe I just added confusion. I don't know. Sorry about that.
I think
you got it right. Mr. Schuman.
So if I know we're talking about two different things here, but if we vote to not delay the implementation, then those changes that we made will be allowed sooner, and so those businesses will be allowed to do the temporary. Then there's no permit requirement. Is that what I heard? So there's no permit requirement, and then they can go ahead and do that, use other vehicles for advertising. So if we don't delay implementation, we don't delay implementation, so we move this along as fast as possible, and then that will include what you want to allow them to use vehicles, and there's no during the COVID, whatever, for the foreseeable future here to July or whatever, they won't have to get a permit. So that's pretty much what you want, and that would by moving this along, that's what we'll get. Okay, that's how I see it. I hope I'm right.
You are. But we're also allowing the additional signage as well for the other businesses outside of the vehicle issues. And
yeah, no, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm totally in favor of the rest of the ordinance. My confusion was that we were going to allow vehicle signage in more latitude than what was in this proposed addition to the request. And so that this is the important point that I want to get clear from the director. So based on the current COVID legislation and assuming that the vehicle permit 30 days was implemented as part of this legislation when we were talking about vehicle permits. Does the 30-day, does the permit just, they don't have to do a permit now during this COVID part as it relates to vehicle signage? That's really what this is enabling as currently the COVID's written, and then if we were to add that vehicle stuff.
Correct. There's one category of temporary signage, I believe just one, that required a permit, and we're saying that category of signage does no longer require a permit, and that's to include, as amended, the vehicle sign language that will include into this area. So correct. So under the COVID policy, temporary vehicle signs wouldn't require a permit, and once the COVID period ends, it would go back to requiring a permit for use of any signage on vehicles.
All right. Now, I just want to make sure I understand what are the other signs? Everything else is, what are the other things that the COVID legislation again is? I got to pull it back up again. Temporary signs.
It's no permit. The time will last until the end of the state restrictions, and then 2 additional signs in addition to that, those that are currently permitted
Okay.
per business unit for building.
So now we're adding this really type 4 says yard, banner, window, or vehicle.
Yes, and we'll have to add some language about the, if you're specifically not wanting to include tractors and trailers, we'll have to put a little footnote and a caveat that we can run by committee to make sure it's capturing your concern about vehicles and not tractor trailers, et cetera. But yes.
Yeah. So I'm Madam Chair, personally, I'm not in favor of adding vehicles, but it's not a showstopper. It's the will of the committee.
Director, is it possible that we can also put in this section just for extra leverage that the vehicles must be operable, current license and everything else? Okay, just to prevent
We can
what,
reference the sections of the code that are continuing to be in effect.
okay. Fair enough. Okay, so are we all good with this now?
Yeah, I mean, Madam Chair, I'll probably vote no, but it's not a showstopper, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll make a motion to amend the temporary sign restriction due to the pandemic. Is that correct? How you want me to go ahead, Director Lieber?
I think the motion you're trying to make is that you are going to add a new section to the body of ordinance 2020-79 that will adopt the proposed COVID-19 temporary signs in non-residential districts policy, and that will include the additional amendment of allowing certain vehicle signs as temporary commercial signage.
So this COVID policy wasn't in here before, though.
We have a COVID policy, but this will replace our existing one.
Okay. So then I'll make the amendment as stated by Director Lieber and ask for a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Nay.
Okay, 2-1. And then number 6.
Madam, I don't think we need any more discussion. I just wanted to make sure I understood all the other conversation before we voted on this.
Are we done then? We're not discussing number 6?
No, we do have to vote on number 6. Correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I didn't have any additional questions or conversation. Maybe other council members did, but I didn't have any other comments on 6. I just didn't want to vote till the end.
Okay. Mr. Schuman?
I think we should go ahead and implement this as soon as possible, and so I'd be no on delaying it.
Okay. Any other comments from council? Okay. Seeing none, then I will make a motion then to make no recommendation on number 6, I guess. And ask for a second.
Second.
All right, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So, Directors Grow and Lieber, is it possible that we can reconvene this committee after our chicken coop just to, next Tuesday, just to go over how the changes will read in the new ordinance so we can proceed with this at our next council meeting?
I think we're all scheduled to be there anyways, so that's fine. I'll be, if Director Lieber, I think we can get these put together here in the next day or two maybe, and get you some language, and we can talk about it after the chicken coops.
I would
Yes, but
potentially have it done before the chicken coops or perhaps in lieu of the chicken coops, but I don't get it.
I just want to make sure that, all of the amendments are done. I don't want to rehash all of this conversation. And, I think that we've covered everything as much as we can, but I just want to make sure that the amendments are what we had hoped for.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
Okay. All right.
Can I
So
go
then
home now?
It's not a problem. I'll make sure Kim writes everything tomorrow. Just kidding.
I'll take the cliff notes on that, please.
I'm just kidding, Kim. We'll meet up tomorrow.
It's true.
Our clerk, would you please add this to our BZD committee meeting for next week? Thank you so much. All right, and with that being the end of our agenda, I will close this meeting at 9:22.
This conference will now be recorded.
What is the next process is on this? Okay, so I just heard you're gonna take the finished ordinance and you're sending it to the building committee and committee, and then you're gonna send it to the full city council? Is that the process?
We're having another committee meeting next week for our final piece of legislation to be done so we can review it to make sure all of the changes are in place.
Okay, so you have a vote on the final thing in your next committee meeting. And then you have,
Review it as to form, and then it'll go to full council then on November 4th
okay,
on second reading, and then it'll be on third reading at the next meeting after that. So I can't even,
sometime in December.
it should be the end of November.
Okay,
November 17th, I believe.
okay, so sometime around Thanksgiving, it'll be in an ordinance and in effect.
Well,
And-
council will vote on it at that time.
Okay, and then that's when our sign guy can then apply for the building committee for the variances that we're gonna have to go and try to seek.
Well,
I know I'm gonna get asked about a timetable, let's put it that way.
I believe that the ordinance would have 30 days, because I don't think so it'd be 30 days after the passage.
Okay, so start of the new year, just to round it off.
30 days after we vote on it.
Okay, and then we can go and apply for the variances and all that in January. Right?
Director Weaver, is that correct?
I'm sorry. So it will go into effect 30 days after the passage, like you said. And it would not stop the applicant if they wanted to apply for, depending on the outcome, again, of the amendments in the ordinance. They could, if they see that the proposal is going to pass in a way that doesn't allow them their sign, they don't need to wait until the effective date if they wish to proceed sooner than that to the appeals board. If the new code is giving them no more additional rights than they currently have, there's really, I don't know, there would be a strong reason to wait if they wanted to take an appeal. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Might as well get the process started if it has a final version.
Right.
Okay. And
Okay,
is it just one application? Because it looks like we're going to have to do 2 appeals. One is that our proposed sign has LED on 2 sides so that people can see it as they drive by at 35 miles an hour.
You know,
And the other one is that it's in front of a church.
Why
on
don't you follow up with me outside this meeting, and I'll be happy to walk through what I think the process will need to be.
Well, I will probably have Dan from Wagner Signs, Dan Beeman, contact you because he's going to have to go through this with all of his clients.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
Thank you.
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Glasser had his hand up. You're
Well,
good?
the meeting is
Oh, all right.
over. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.